Well, this is certainly modest, Charlotte said, her lips pressed into a thin line as she looked me up and down in the marble entryway of the Ashford family estate, her eyes lingering on my simple cotton dress from Target with barely concealed distaste. I stood there on that warm September afternoon, my worn canvas flat squeaking slightly against the imported Italian tile, watching my fiancé James's mother catalog every inexpensive detail of my appearance, and I felt the familiar weight of judgment settle over me like a blanket I'd deliberately wrapped around myself. The irony wasn't lost on me. My name is Emma Chen. I'm 30 years old, and I'm worth approximately $40 million, the founder and CEO of Technova Solutions, a cybersecurity firm that's currently being courted by 3 Fortune 500 companies. But Charlotte Ashford didn't know that because I'd made absolutely certain she wouldn't. I'd chosen this cheap sundress carefully, paired it with a cardigan that had a small pull in the sleeve, left my hair in a simple ponytail without the professional styling I usually wore to board meetings, and scrubbed my face clean of everything except drugstore mascara. I wanted to see if James's family would accept me for who I was, not what I had, and judging by the way Charlotte's nose wrinkled as though she'd detected something unpleasant, I already had my answer. "Mom, be nice," James said, but his tone was light, almost joking, and he didn't meet my eyes when I glanced at him. I thought back to 3 months ago, to the charity gala at the Fairmont, where I'd gone to represent Technova as a platinum sponsor, where I'd stepped away from the tiresome conversations about market disruption and valuation to grab some air near the catering station, and that's where James had found me. He'd been charming, genuinely so, approaching me with an easy smile and asking if I could point him toward the shrimp cocktail, clearly assuming I was part of the catering staff in my simple black dress. And instead of correcting him, I'd found myself playing along, amused by the mistake, intrigued by this handsome man who talked to me like I was a real person rather than a potential business connection. We'd talked for an hour that night, him apologizing profusely when he finally realized I was a guest, me laughing and telling him it didn't matter, and the connection had felt so genuine, so refreshingly uncomplicated. Now, standing in his family's Connecticut estate with its vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers and oil paintings of ancestors who'd made their fortune in railroads a century ago, watching Charlotte sneer at my $20 dress, I wondered if anything about our relationship had ever been genuine at all. Dinner was served in the formal dining room at precisely 7 o'clock. The long mahogany table set with china so delicate I worried about breathing too hard near it, and I found myself seated between James and his sister Melissa, directly across from his parents, Robert and Charlotte, the arrangement feeling distinctly like a tribunal. Robert was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from generations of family money, currently a managing director at Goldman Sachs, and he started the interrogation almost immediately after the first course arrived. "So, Emma, James mentioned you work with computers," he said, cutting into his beef tenderloin with surgical precision. And I could hear the dismissiveness in how he said computers, as though I'd told him I collected bottle caps for a living. I smiled sweetly, playing my role perfectly. "Yes, I help with websites and things like that, technical stuff," I said, deliberately keeping my language vague and unsophisticated, watching Charlotte's expression tighten with what looked like satisfaction at having her assumptions confirmed. Melissa, who was 26 and worked as a fashion buyer for Bergdorf Goodman, a job her father's connections had secured, leaned forward with barely concealed condescension. "That's nice. Like a little hobby job," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm sure it keeps you busy." I nodded, taking a sip of the wine that probably cost more than most people's car payments, while internally I calculated that my company's annual revenue was approximately 60 times what Melissa made in a year. "So tell me, dear," Charlotte said, her tone suggesting the dear was anything but affectionate. "What exactly are your family's circumstances? James has been rather vague about your background." The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. My parents immigrated from Taiwan when I was 2, I said truthfully, though I omitted that my father was now a respected research scientist and my mother a university professor. They worked really hard to give me opportunities. I put myself through state school. Charlotte's smile was sharp. How admirable! James, of course, went to Yale, as did his father and his grandfather before that. The unspoken comparison sat between us like a third guest. Robert launched into a story about James's accomplishments at the family firm, how he was being groomed for a partnership, his future secured, and I watched James smile and accept the praise while saying nothing about me, nothing about us, nothing that suggested I was anything more than an accessory to his predetermined life. Then Melissa extended her left hand, where a large emerald-cut diamond caught the chandelier light, easily 3 carats. My fiancé just proposed last month, she said, looking at my own ring with an expression I couldn't quite read. That's a beautiful setting you have, Emma. Is that cubic zirconia? There's no shame in it, really. Not everyone can afford the real thing. I looked down at my engagement ring, the rare pink diamond that I'd chosen myself from a private jeweler in Manhattan, a stone so unique that only a handful existed in that particular cut, and clarity, worth $180,000, purchased without a second thought because I'd loved how it caught the light and reminded me of sunset over the Pacific. It's special to me, I said quietly, not correcting her assumption, and I saw James shift uncomfortably beside me, but he said nothing, nothing to defend me or correct his sister's casual cruelty. Charlotte steered the conversation to their world, discussing their country club, their vacation home in Martha's Vineyard, their social circle, and every reference felt like a gentle reminder that I didn't belong, that I was an outsider who couldn't possibly understand their rarefied existence. James deserves someone who understands his world, Charlotte said, looking directly at me, her meaning crystal clear. Someone who can navigate our social obligations, who comes from similar circumstances. James laughed, actually laughed, as though his mother had made a joke rather than insulted his fiancée to her face, and I felt something crack inside my chest, a small fissure in the foundation of what I'd thought we were building together. This was the man I'd fallen for, who'd seemed so different from the others in my industry, who'd pursued me with such apparent sincerity. And now he sat beside me, letting his family treat me like I was some gold digger who'd trapped their precious son. I remembered why I'd built walls around myself in the first place, why I'd learned early in my career to reveal nothing personal, to keep my success close and my vulnerabilities closer. Because people always showed you who they really were when they thought you had nothing they wanted. After the dessert course, Charlotte touched my elbow with her cold fingers and guided me away from the dining room with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, saying something about showing me the library, and I followed her down a long hallway lined with family portraits, men in military uniforms and women in pearls, generations of Ashford wealth staring down at me with the same disapproving expression Charlotte wore now. She closed the heavy oak door behind us, and the pleasant facade she'd maintained through dinner evaporated like morning fog, her face hardening into something sharp and calculating. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Emma," she said, crossing her arms over her silk blouse that probably cost more than my entire outfit times 10. "You seem like a practical girl, so I'm going to be direct. You're clearly after James's money, and while I can't fault you for seeing an opportunity, I can't allow you to take advantage of my son." I opened my mouth to speak, but she held up one manicured hand, her wedding ring catching the light from the Tiffany lamp, easily 10 carats of diamonds that represented old money and older values. James has a trust fund worth $5 million that becomes fully accessible when he marries, and his position at his father's firm is guaranteed, with a partnership track that will make him extraordinarily wealthy in his own right, she continued, her voice matter-of-fact, as though she were discussing stock portfolios rather than her son's life. "I've seen girls like you before, girls who think they can marry into a different class, and it never works. You'll always be uncomfortable in our world, always struggling to keep up. always aware that you don't really belong. The words stung not because they reflected any truth, but because of the casual cruelty with which she delivered them, the absolute certainty that she was right to judge me, to dismiss me, to reduce me to nothing more than a social climber with dollar signs in her eyes. Charlotte reached into her handbag, an Hermes Birkin that I recognized because my assistant Sarah had one in a different color, and pulled out a check already written and signed. "I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 to end this engagement gracefully," she said, holding it out to me like she was offering a treat to a dog. "Tell James you realized you want different things, that the relationship moved too fast. Whatever story allows him to save face. Take this money, start fresh somewhere else, and everyone walks away with their dignity intact." I stared at the check, at the neat zeros following the 5, and something twisted in my chest, because this wasn't about the money, it was never about the money. My company's last funding round had valued Technova at $120 million, and my personal net worth was already $40 million. But Charlotte looked at me and saw nothing, saw someone worth so little that $50,000 would be enough to make me disappear. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, keeping my voice steady even as my heart pounded with anger and hurt. "But I love James, and I'm not going anywhere." Charlotte's expression shifted from confident to cold, her eyes narrowing as she tucked the check back into her bag with deliberate slowness. "Then you've made a very poor choice," she said, her voice dropping to something almost threatening. "I will make your life very difficult, Emma. Every family event, every social obligation, every moment you spend trying to integrate into our world, I will be there reminding you that you don't belong, that you're not good enough, that my son deserves better." She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "James hasn't told us much about you, has he? Almost nothing, really, beyond the basic facts. That should tell you something about how he sees this relationship, about where you fit in his actual life." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and I stood alone in the library surrounded by leather-bound books that probably no one in this house had read in decades, feeling the full weight of what I'd just learned. Not about Charlotte's cruelty, which I'd expected, but about James's silence, his careful compartmentalization of me, keeping me separate from his real world like I was something temporary, something that didn't require full integration or explanation. And I realized that he'd never told them anything real about me because he'd never bothered to ask, never showed genuine curiosity about my work, or my life, or my dreams. Content to accept the simple version I'd presented because it made me easier to fit into whatever role he'd decided I should play. I drove to James's apartment in Tribeca that night, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, and by the time I knocked on his door, at nearly midnight, my carefully maintained composure had crystallized into something hard and clear, a determination to understand exactly who I'd agreed to marry. He opened the door in sweatpants and a Yale t-shirt, surprised to see me, and I walked past him into the minimalist living room his decorator had designed, all glass and chrome and expensive emptiness. "We need to talk about tonight," I said, turning to face him, and he immediately went defensive, his shoulders tensing in that way I'd started to recognize meant he knew he'd done something wrong, but didn't want to acknowledge it. "My family can be intense, Em, but they'll come around," he said, pouring himself a scotch from the bar cart without offering me anything, a small gesture that suddenly felt significant. "They just need time to adjust to you." The words hit me wrong, the phrasing, as though I were something foreign that required adjustment rather than a person who deserved basic respect. "Adjust to me?" I repeated quietly. "James, your mother offered me $50,000 to leave you. Your sister implied my engagement ring was fake. And your father lectured me like I was a child who needed lessons in basic economics. And you said nothing. You defended nothing. You just laughed along like their cruelty was charming." He took a long drink, not meeting my eyes. "They're protective, that's all. And honestly, Emma, you have to understand that my ex-girlfriend Victoria was from our world. She knew how to handle these situations. and my mother really thought we'd end up together, so this is an adjustment for everyone." There it was. Victoria's name dropped so casually, and I felt something inside me go very still. "You're comparing me to your ex right now?" I asked, and he realized his mistake too late, backtracking quickly. "No, that's not what I meant. I just meant that you're different from what they expected, and that's actually what I love about you, Em. You're so low-key and easy, not high maintenance like Victoria was, not constantly needing attention or validation or expensive things. You're just yourself, and that's refreshing." The words were meant as compliments. I could see that in his expression. But they landed like stones in my chest because I heard what he wasn't saying. That he valued me for being undemanding, for requiring little, for making his life simple, rather than challenging him to be better. "Why didn't you tell your family? Anything real about me?" I asked, switching tactics. "About my work, my education, anything beyond the most basic facts?" James shrugged, settling onto his leather couch that probably cost more than my first car. "I don't know, we don't really talk about that stuff, and honestly, I liked keeping you separate from all that family drama. Keeping us in our own bubble, you know?" But I didn't know, because keeping someone separate meant keeping them less than fully integrated, keeping them optional, keeping them at a distance that allowed for easy removal if necessary. "What exactly do you know about my job, James?" I asked, testing, wanting to see how deep his disinterest went. He looked uncomfortable, gesturing vaguely. "You do tech stuff, websites and apps and things. It's great that you're passionate about it, but it's not really my world, so I don't always follow all the details." 7 months of dating, 3 months engaged, and he'd never once asked to visit my office, meet my team, understand the work that consumed 60 hours of my week. And I realized that he'd been content with the surface version of me because the surface was all he wanted. Anything deeper would have required actual effort and genuine curiosity. "Your mother thinks I'm after your trust fund," I said, watching his face carefully. "She mentioned it's worth $5 million, accessible when you marry." James had the grace to look embarrassed. "She shouldn't have discussed that with you. That's inappropriate. But yes, there's family money, and I'm being groomed for partnership at Dad's firm, so our future is secure. Which is why I don't understand why you're so upset, Emma. We'll be fine financially." Our future, as though it were already determined, already mapped out according to his family's blueprint, and I suddenly saw how this would unfold. Me playing the grateful wife who'd married up, forever reminded of how lucky I was, forever trying to prove I belonged in their world while James collected the rewards of having chosen someone who made him feel generous and magnanimous. "Maybe I should try harder with your family," I said, shifting my approach, still not revealing my truth because I needed to see how far this would go. "Maybe dress nicer for the next dinner?" James's face brightened immediately, relieved that I was being reasonable. "That's a great idea, actually. Maybe let Melissa take you shopping. She has amazing taste and she could help you pick out some pieces that would work better for family events. Things you maybe couldn't normally afford on your salary, but we could cover it. Think of it as an investment in our future together." The casual assumption that I couldn't afford nice clothing, that I needed his family's financial assistance, that I should be grateful for their charity, settled over me like a weight, and I smiled, a quiet smile that felt strange on my face, because it wasn't born of happiness, but of decision. "That sounds perfect," I said, and I watched him relax completely, coming over to kiss my forehead like I was a child who'd finally understood the lesson. The engagement party was in 4 weeks, I knew. Plenty of time to play this role completely, to see exactly how deep their dismissal went, and then I would show them precisely who they'd underestimated, not for revenge, but for truth, because I needed to know if James could love the real me, or if he'd only ever wanted the diminished version, and somewhere deep in my heart I already knew the answer. But I needed to see it fully, needed to watch it unfold, so I could walk away without doubt or regret. The 3 weeks that followed felt like performance art, each family dinner a new exercise in endurance, and I played my role with careful precision while documenting every moment in my memory, like evidence for a trial I was building against my own foolish heart. Charlotte presented the prenuptial agreement at the second dinner, sliding the thick document across the table with her lawyer's business card attached, saying it was standard procedure for James's protection, as though I were a threat that needed legal containment. And when I took it home to my actual lawyer, David Morrison, who'd handled Technova's contracts since our Series A funding, he read through it with increasing disbelief before finally looking up at me and saying, "Emma, this isn't a prenuptial agreement. This is financial abuse in legal form. You would get absolutely nothing in a divorce, no assets, no support, completely restricted from any of James's family wealth. And honestly, I've seen more generous terms in corporate hostile takeovers." I'd nodded slowly, feeling something hard and certain settling in my chest, because this document revealed everything I needed to know about how the Ashford family viewed me. Not as a future daughter-in-law, but as a potential liability requiring complete legal neutralization. Robert cornered me at the third dinner, steering me into his study under the pretense of getting to know me better, and proceeded to lecture me for 45 minutes about money management and living within my means, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that wealthy men use when they think they're being educational, telling me that James would handle all the finances in our marriage, because these things are complex, Emma, and you shouldn't worry your pretty head about investment strategies or portfolio diversification, just focus on making a nice home. And I sat there thinking about the $40 million in my personal accounts, the diversified portfolio my financial advisor managed across real estate, tech stocks, and venture capital investments, the fact that I'd negotiated billion-dollar contracts and understood compound interest before I could legally drink. Melissa took me shopping on a crisp Saturday afternoon, and the experience was so perfectly cruel, it almost felt choreographed, the way she steered me past Bergdorf Goodman and Saks Fifth Avenue, toward a mid-range department store, her expression barely concealing her contempt as she guided me to the clearance section, holding up modest dresses with visible disdain and saying things like, "This would work for you," and "It's actually quite nice for the price point," while she loaded her own arms with designer pieces, Stella McCartney and Isabel Marant, and Alexander Wang, ultimately spending $8,000 on her father's credit card, while I carefully selected one simple navy dress for $300, playing grateful and overwhelmed by her generosity. My phone buzzed while Melissa was trying on a Chanel jacket, and I excused myself to the bathroom, closing the stall door before answering Sarah's call, and my assistant's excited voice cut through the manufactured humility I'd been performing. "Emma, we got it. Patterson Industries signed. 50 million over 3 years. Mark is opening champagne in the conference room, and the whole team is celebrating." And I felt the strange cognitive dissonance of standing in a department store bathroom stall in my Target jeans, while my company secured a Fortune 500 contract that would push our annual revenue past $120 million. I congratulated Sarah quietly, asked her to thank the team, promised I'd be back in the office Monday, and when I emerged, Melissa was waiting with raised eyebrows, asking if everything was okay, and I smiled and said it was just a work thing, nothing important, and watched her dismiss it completely. Returning to her shopping, while I carried my single modest dress like a trophy of my own degradation, each of these experiences adding weight to the certainty growing inside me that this engagement was already over, had been over since that first dinner. Maybe had never really begun, because James had never wanted to marry the real me, only the diminished version that made him feel magnanimous and superior. And I was done making myself small for people who would never bother to look up and see my actual height. The engagement party loomed 3 weeks away, and Charlotte took over the planning with the territorial aggression of a general staging a military campaign, informing me via a brief phone call that she'd already booked the Riverside Country Club for the third Saturday in October, selected a guest list of 200 people from their social circle, and chosen a theme she called Timeless Elegance, which apparently meant white florals, champagne fountains, and a string quartet playing classical music that would showcase the Ashford family's refined taste. When I gently suggested inviting some of my friends and colleagues, Charlotte's voice went cold over the phone, saying that this was really more of a family event and I wouldn't want to make my people uncomfortable in such a formal setting, would I? The implication being that my people were too unsophisticated to handle country club etiquette, and I'd agreed quietly while sitting in my corner office overlooking the Hudson River, surrounded by awards and patents and framed magazine covers featuring my company's innovations. James forwarded me Charlotte's planning emails without comment, and I noticed my name appeared only twice in the extensive documentation, once as James's fiancée Emma, and once in a note about seating arrangements that placed me at the family table, but somehow also separate, positioned between James's elderly aunt, who was hard of hearing, and a family friend I'd never met. The prenup pressure intensified daily, with Charlotte texting me articles about the importance of financial clarity in modern marriages, and James growing increasingly uncomfortable with my continued hesitation, finally sitting me down in his apartment and saying that maybe I was being difficult about this, that his family just wanted everyone protected. And didn't I trust him? Didn't I believe in our future together? And I'd looked at this man I'd thought I loved and realized he'd never once asked why I might hesitate to sign away rights to assets I didn't actually need from him. Never once been curious about what I might be protecting or building or creating in my own life. Marcus called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing the prenup for the dozenth time, his voice tight with barely contained excitement as he said the words I'd been waiting 7 years to hear. Emma, the board approved it. We're going public, December 15th. And the initial valuation is coming in at $300 million, which means your 60% stake puts you at $180 million on paper. And even accounting for lockup periods and market fluctuations, you're looking at being worth over $200 million within the first year. And I sat very still in my office, watching the autumn sunlight paint gold across my desk, feeling the weight of this achievement settle into my bones. That evening, I met James for dinner at the Italian place he loved, and I told him about the engagement party, asked if he was excited, and he smiled and said he was mostly relieved his mother was handling everything because these events were complicated and required a certain touch. And I realized he meant they required a touch I didn't possess, a sophistication born of old money and social training that he believed I lacked, and something crystallized in that moment, a decision forming with the clarity of inevitability. The engagement party wouldn't just be a celebration, I decided. It would be a revelation, a moment of truth where I would show James and his family exactly who they'd dismissed. Not for revenge, but for honesty. Because I needed to see if James could love the real me, or if he'd only ever wanted the diminished version. And I began planning carefully, methodically, the way I'd planned product launches and investor presentations, understanding that this moment would require perfect timing and irrefutable evidence and the courage to walk away from a fantasy I'd been sustaining through willful blindness. The day before the engagement party, I drove to the Riverside Country Club under the pretense of wanting to see the final setup, telling James I was nervous and needed the reassurance of seeing everything come together, and he'd kissed my forehead distractedly while checking his phone, saying that was sweet, and his mother would appreciate my interest. I arrived at 2 in the afternoon to find the events team transforming the ballroom into Charlotte's vision of timeless elegance, white roses and hydrangeas everywhere, crystal chandeliers catching the October sunlight, and I walked through it all feeling like I was attending my own funeral, beautiful and cold, and ultimately about endings rather than beginnings. The club manager, Richard Peterson, spotted me near the terrace, and his eyes widened with recognition before he smoothly approached, shaking my hand with genuine warmth and saying quietly, "Ms. Chen, what a surprise! I didn't realize you were the Emma getting engaged. Congratulations!" And I appreciated that he didn't announce my identity to the staff bustling around us, understanding instinctively that my presence here was complicated. We stepped into his office and I explained the situation carefully, not all of it but enough, and Richard listened with the diplomatic expression of someone who'd witnessed countless family dramas play out in his ballroom. And when I asked if the club's AV system could handle a wireless presentation from my phone, he smiled slightly and reminded me that Technova had installed and integrated the entire infrastructure last year, top-of-the-line equipment that could do essentially anything I needed. I gave him specific instructions for tomorrow evening, a presentation cued at 7:15, and he nodded and made notes and promised complete discretion, and I thanked him and slipped him a folded check for $10,000 for his trouble, which he tried to refuse before accepting with quiet grace. That evening, I went through Charlotte's meticulously organized guest list, 200 names I'd memorized over the past weeks, and I began making calls to the 15 people I knew professionally, business leaders and investors and tech executives who existed in both my world and the Ashford social sphere. And I didn't reveal everything, but I planted careful seeds, mentioned I was looking forward to seeing them tomorrow, hoped we might discuss some interesting developments. The final family dinner before the party felt like a tribunal, Charlotte presiding over the table with rigid satisfaction, the prenup sitting between us like a weapon she'd finally decided to deploy with full force, and she announced that I needed to sign it tonight, before the party, or there simply wouldn't be a wedding, her voice carrying that inflectionless certainty of someone who'd never been denied anything she demanded. James shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, which was its own form of agreement, and I was opening my mouth to respond when the doorbell rang and Melissa went to answer it, returning with Victoria gliding beside her like a swan among ducks, elegant in cream silk and pearl earrings, her blonde hair perfectly styled, everything about her screaming old money and social training and exactly what Charlotte wanted for her son. James stood abruptly, his face flushing, stammering that he didn't know Victoria was coming, and Charlotte smiled serenely and said she'd taken the liberty of inviting her since Victoria was practically family and would be attending the party anyway. And I watched this performance understanding it was meant to demonstrate what I could never be: the contrast between Victoria's effortless sophistication and my carefully maintained ordinariness. Victoria kissed James's cheek with familiar ease, complimented the house, then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, saying how quaint it was to meet me finally. James had mentioned I did something with computers, how nice that I had a little hobby to keep me busy, and I smiled back and agreed that I did enjoy my work while internally cataloging every microaggression like evidence for a case I was building against my own foolish hope. They reminisced over dinner, Victoria and James, about trips to the Hamptons and charity galas and people I'd never met, and Charlotte encouraged every memory, every shared laugh, while James grew more animated than I'd seen him in weeks, and I sat there watching the man I'd agreed to marry become more fully himself in the presence of someone from his own world, watching him choose comfort over courage, familiarity over growth, and I felt the last threads of my romantic illusions snap cleanly. Charlotte presented the prenup again as dessert was served, sliding it across to me with a pen, her voice harder now, insisting I sign tonight or she would cancel the party tomorrow, and James looked at me with pleading eyes that begged me not to make a scene, not to embarrass him in front of Victoria. And I realized he was exactly as weak as he'd shown himself to be, that I'd kept hoping for hidden strength that simply didn't exist. I excused myself quietly, murmuring something about the restroom, and walked through the Ashford house with my phone already in my hand, my heart pounding with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. And I locked myself in the powder room with its expensive marble counters and called David Chen, my attorney, who answered on the second ring, and listened as I gave him precise instructions to prepare complete documentation of my assets, the company valuation reports from our last funding round, my personal bank statements, the Forbes profile that would run next month, everything that proved exactly who I was and what I'd built. And he asked if I was certain about this public exposure because once this information was out, there would be no taking it back. And I told him I'd never been more certain of anything, that I needed this truth like I needed air. I hung up and immediately called Sarah, my assistant, who'd been with me since the early days when we were working out of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, and I told her I needed her at the Riverside Country Club tomorrow evening at 7, and to bring the company portfolio, the bound presentation we used for major investor meetings, and she asked what was happening, and I could hear the worry in her voice. And I explained briefly that I was ending my engagement in the most spectacular way possible, and I needed her support. And she laughed suddenly and said she'd been waiting for me to wake up since she'd met James at our Labor Day barbecue and seen how he introduced me to his friends as his girlfriend who does tech stuff without any pride or real interest. And her loyalty in that moment made my eyes burn with grateful tears. Then I called Marcus, my business partner, and the person who'd believed in Technova when it was just an idea I'd sketched on napkins at 3 in the morning, and his voice was cautious when he answered because he knew I was at James's family dinner, and I never called during those carefully scheduled performances. And I told him what I was planning for tomorrow, and he was silent for a long moment, before asking if I was sure I wanted to tie our company's public image to what might look like personal revenge. And I understood his concern, but I explained that this wasn't about revenge, it was about refusing to be diminished, about showing that women could build empires and still be dismissed if they didn't perform their success loudly enough. And he sighed and said he trusted my judgment, and he'd make sure our PR team was prepared for any fallout. And I loved him for understanding that this mattered beyond business optics. I steadied myself, fixed my lipstick, and returned to the dining room to find Victoria had somehow migrated to my seat beside James, her hand resting casually on the back of his chair while Charlotte beamed at them like she was watching her fondest wish materialize. And Melissa was showing Victoria something on her phone, and Robert was refilling wine glasses, and they all looked up when I entered, as if I'd interrupted something private and important. And James had the grace to look uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to ask Victoria to move. I remained calm, gracious, smiling softly as I reclaimed my seat on James's other side, and Charlotte pushed the prenup toward me again, her perfectly manicured nail tapping the signature line. And I looked at this document that would sign away rights to money I didn't need from people who'd never valued me, and I said clearly, "I'll sign it tomorrow at the party. Whatever James wants, I just want him to be happy." And the relief that flooded James's face was almost comical, and he hugged me and called me so understanding, so easy, so perfect, and I felt absolutely nothing except a strange, distant sadness for the fantasy I'd constructed around this weak man. Victoria left shortly after with air kisses and promises to see everyone tomorrow, and Charlotte walked her out with obvious affection. And when they returned, Charlotte actually smiled at me for the first time, a cold, satisfied smile that said I'd finally accepted my place. And the rest of the evening passed in a blur of wedding talk and party logistics, and James's hand in mine feeling like a stranger's touch. And when I finally left and drove back to my apartment in Tribeca, the city lights blurring past my windows, I let myself cry. Not for James anymore because I'd stopped loving him somewhere between the prenup ultimatum and Victoria's appearance, but for the fantasy I'd allowed myself to believe in. The hope that someone could love me without needing to diminish me. The fairy tale I'd been foolish enough to write in my head where love conquered prejudice and family could choose connection over class. And I cried until I had nothing left. And then I washed my face and went to bed and slept more soundly than I had in months, because tomorrow everything would finally be true. The morning of the engagement party, I woke at 6 with the strange calm that comes after a decision has been made irrevocably, and I dressed carefully in the modest navy dress Melissa had steered me toward at Nordstrom Rack, the one that cost $47 and made me look like someone's underpaid assistant. And I styled my hair simply, minimal makeup, the performance of smallness I'd perfected over these humiliating weeks. And when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself, but I knew this was the last time I'd ever hide like this. I arrived at the Riverside Country Club at 5:30, the party scheduled to begin at 6, and Charlotte was already there directing staff with military precision. And when she saw me, she looked satisfied, nodding approvingly at my appearance, saying I looked appropriate for once, and I smiled and thanked her and asked if there was anything I could help with, and she waved me away, saying I should just stay out of the way and try not to embarrass James in front of their friends. The ballroom looked spectacular, I had to admit. Thousands of white roses and hydrangeas, crystal everywhere, a string quartet playing near the terrace, bars set up at each corner with premium liquor, and the guest list began arriving promptly at 6, women in designer gowns and men in expensive suits, the kind of people who summered in the Hamptons and wintered in Aspen. And I stood near the entrance in my cheap dress, greeting them politely while Charlotte claimed credit for everything, and James worked the room like the social climber he was. And I watched him kiss cheeks and shake hands and laugh at jokes, and I felt absolutely nothing except determination. Victoria arrived at 6:20 in a stunning emerald dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she smirked when she saw me, making a comment about how sweet my dress was, very Sunday school teacher, and Melissa laughed and James looked uncomfortable but said nothing, and I smiled and complimented Victoria's gown and moved away before my facade cracked. I mingled carefully, playing my role, and several guests were people I knew from business contexts, board members and investors and CEOs who'd attended Technova presentations. And I caught their eyes and gave subtle signals, and they understood and said nothing, but I saw the confusion and curiosity building. At 7 o'clock exactly, Charlotte called for everyone's attention, tapping a knife against her champagne glass, and the room quieted, and she announced that before dinner, they were going to make everything official, that Emma would be signing the prenuptial agreement that protected James's interests, and she gestured toward a table that had been set up near the front, with the documents laid out ceremonially, and there was polite applause, and I saw several guests exchange glances because this was tacky, even by country club standards, making a spectacle of a prenup. But Charlotte was too triumphant to care about propriety. I walked toward the table slowly, aware of 200 pairs of eyes on me, and James stood beside his mother beaming like this was a normal, wonderful moment. And Charlotte handed me an expensive pen with obvious satisfaction, saying something about how she was glad I'd finally seen reason, and I took the pen and held it above the signature line, and the room was completely silent, waiting. And I looked up and met Charlotte's eyes and said clearly, my voice steady and loud enough for everyone to hear, "Before I sign, I have something to share with everyone here." I smiled at Charlotte with genuine warmth for the first time in weeks, and I said clearly so everyone in the ballroom could hear, "Thank you so much, Charlotte, for preparing this generous prenuptial agreement that protects James's $5 million trust fund. I really do appreciate the thought you put into safeguarding his assets." And I watched her preening slightly at what she thought was capitulation, and then I continued, "But I won't actually be signing this version because I've asked my attorney to draft a different prenuptial agreement, one that protects my current assets of approximately $40 million, plus my equity stake in my company Technova, which was valued at $120 million in our last funding round 3 months ago." And the silence that crashed over the room was so complete, I could hear the string quartet still playing faintly on the terrace. Charlotte's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion giving way to disbelief, giving way to a forced laugh as she said loudly, "Don't be ridiculous, Emma, this isn't funny." And James was staring at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language, and I remained perfectly calm as I pulled out my phone and opened the browser to Technova's website, our company profile that listed our leadership team with professional headshots and credentials. And there was my face next to the title Founder and Chief Executive Officer, and I held up my phone and said clearly, "I'm not being ridiculous, I'm being accurate." And then I walked to the presentation screen that I'd arranged yesterday with the club manager, the screen that Charlotte thought was for displaying engagement photos. And I connected my phone, and suddenly my professional profile was projected 15 feet high for 200 guests to see. The murmuring started immediately, people leaning toward each other and whispering. And then Jonathan Reeves, one of Robert's oldest colleagues from the investment banking world, stood up and said in a bewildered voice, "Emma Chen from Technova? We just partnered with your company last quarter for our entire digital infrastructure overhaul. The contract was $50 million. And his wife Margaret added, "I heard you speak at the Women in Technology conference in Boston. You were brilliant. And suddenly other voices joined in. People I'd recognized throughout the evening who'd been watching this performance with growing confusion, and Charlotte's face had gone from pink to white to a mottled red as she turned to James and hissed something I couldn't hear. I advanced to the next slide on the screen, a recent Forbes article titled 30 Under 30, Tech Entrepreneurs Reshaping Silicon Valley. And there I was, third profile down, with a summary of how I'd built Technova from a college dorm room idea into a major player in enterprise software solutions. And I said to the room, my voice steady and clear, I started my company 7 years ago when I was 23, working out of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn with 2 laptops and a dream. And I built it through 90-hour weeks and countless rejections and people telling me I was too young, too inexperienced, too female to succeed in enterprise tech. And I looked directly at Charlotte as I continued. I built something real, something valuable, something that employs 230 people and serves clients in 17 countries, and I did it without anyone's trust fund or family connections or country club networking. I did it because I had an idea and the determination to make it real. The chaos erupted immediately, voices rising in confused exclamations and questions, and Charlotte's face had gone from red to a pale gray as she turned to James and demanded, "Did you know about this?" And James was frozen completely, his mouth opening and closing without sound. And I watched him processing everything, and saw the exact moment he understood how thoroughly he'd misjudged me. And then Charlotte spun back to me and said loudly, "This is some kind of trick, some elaborate fraud. You can't possibly—" But she was interrupted by movement at the ballroom entrance where my lawyer, David Brennan, was arriving exactly on schedule, carrying his leather briefcase, and behind him came Sarah, my assistant, dressed in her usual professional elegance, and with her were 3 of Technova's board members, including Patricia Hernandez, who'd been a venture capitalist for 20 years and commanded respect in every room she entered, and Marcus Chen, my business partner and CTO, whose reputation in the tech world was legendary. David walked directly to me and said in his clear attorney voice that carried across the room, "Ms. Chen, I have the documentation you requested." And he opened his briefcase and began extracting folders, each labeled and organized. Bank statements from Morgan Stanley, showing account balances that made several nearby guests gasp audibly. The most recent company valuation report from Goldman Sachs dated 3 weeks ago, confirming the $120 million figure, contracts bearing the letterhead of Fortune 500 companies, and he laid them on the table where the prenuptial agreement still waited unsigned, and Patricia approached and embraced me warmly, saying, "Emma, congratulations on the IPO approval. The SEC cleared everything yesterday." And Marcus shook my hand formally and said to the crowd, "Emma Chen is the most brilliant entrepreneur I've had the privilege of working with. Technova wouldn't exist without her vision and relentless execution." And suddenly the business leaders in attendance were approaching, wanting to confirm what they were seeing, and James stood absolutely motionless while his face cycled through expressions of shock and confusion and something that might have been grief. Melissa had stumbled backward into a chair, her hand over her mouth, and I saw her eyes fixed on the documentation David was displaying, and Robert had moved closer to the table and was examining the Goldman Sachs valuation report with the practiced eye of an investment banker. And I watched him calculate and recalculate, and saw the moment he understood that my assets exceeded his family's entire net worth by a substantial margin, and he looked up at me with something like horrified respect, and Charlotte was saying, "This can't be real, James. Tell them this isn't real." But her voice had lost its commanding certainty and now sounded desperate and thin. I turned to address the room again, and my voice was steady and clear as I said, "I dressed modestly and said very little these past months, because I wanted James's family to accept me for who I am as a person, not for what I have in my bank accounts. I wanted to know if they could see my worth beyond my net worth." And I paused and looked directly at Charlotte and continued. "Instead, I was mocked for my clothing, dismissed as a gold digger, lectured about money management by people who've never built anything themselves, and ultimately offered money to disappear from James's life. And I turned to Charlotte specifically and said clearly so everyone could hear, "You offered me $50,000 to leave your son alone. Do you remember that conversation in the hallway after our first dinner? You said I was clearly after his money and that I should take your generous offer and disappear gracefully." And Charlotte's face was now completely white, and she opened her mouth but no sound emerged, and I continued. "My company's last quarterly revenue was $30 million, Charlotte, and our profit margin last year was 42%. So your $50,000 offer was approximately what Technova generates in revenue every 3 hours." I turned from Charlotte and the scattered documentation and the 200 guests who were still processing what they'd just witnessed, and I looked directly at James, who stood frozen exactly where he'd been standing for the past 5 minutes, and I said clearly and steadily, "James, I need you to understand something. I fell in love with you because I thought you saw me, the real me, the person underneath everything else, and I believed we had a genuine connection that went deeper than surface appearances or social expectations." And I watched his face as I continued. "But you never once asked about my work beyond accepting my vague descriptions. You never asked about my dreams or my achievements or what I was building. You never wondered why I took calls at odd hours, or why I sometimes seemed distracted by problems I was solving. And I realize now that you didn't ask because you didn't want to know, because you liked me best when I seemed simple and easy and grateful for your attention." The words hung in the air between us, and I saw him flinch, and I pressed on because this needed to be said, all of it, every truth I'd been holding back for months, and I said, "It hurt so much when your family mocked me and you laughed along, when your mother called me unsuitable and you stayed silent, when Melissa treated me like a charity case and you suggested I let her take me shopping for clothes I supposedly couldn't afford. And every single time I waited for you to defend me, to stand up and say that I had value regardless of what your family thought. But you never did, James. You never once chose me over their approval." I could see moisture gathering in his eyes now, and his mouth opened as if to speak, but I shook my head and continued. "I gave you so many chances, so many opportunities to see past the role I was playing and ask deeper questions, to be curious about who I really was. But you preferred the version of me that made you feel generous and protective and superior, the version that needed you instead of choosing you." And my voice remained steady even though my heart was breaking because I was saying goodbye to the fantasy I'd built of who we could have been together. James finally found his voice, and he stepped forward, reaching for my hand, and said desperately, "Emma, I'm so sorry. I did love you. I do love you. I was weak, and I let my family influence me too much, but we can fix this, please. We can start over, and I'll do better. I promise I'll be the man you deserve." And his words tumbled out frantically, apologies mixed with justifications, mixed with pleas. And I looked at him and felt a deep sadness, because I could see he meant it in this moment. He genuinely believed what he was saying, but I also knew that belief would fade as soon as the pressure from his family resumed, as soon as the path of least resistance called to him again. I gently removed my left hand from where he was gripping it, and I twisted the engagement ring off my finger, the pink diamond that had sparked such contempt from Melissa. The ring I'd chosen so carefully because pink diamonds symbolized creativity and strength, and I'd thought we would build something creative and strong together. And I heard several gasps from the crowd as the light caught the stone and revealed its true quality and rarity. And a woman near the front who I recognized as a jewelry appraiser for Sotheby's said audibly, "That's a fancy, vivid pink, flawless, easily worth $200,000 or more." And Melissa made a choking sound that might have been funny under different circumstances. I held the ring between my thumb and forefinger and let the ballroom lights catch the stone one final time, watching the pink fire dance across the facets. And I said clearly to James, and to everyone listening, "I bought this ring myself, by the way. I chose it because pink diamonds symbolize creativity and strength, and I thought we would build something creative and strong together." and I placed it gently in James's palm and closed his fingers around it. And his hand was trembling as he stared down at the ring that probably cost more than his car. And I stepped back and turned to address the entire room one final time, because I needed everyone to understand why I'd done this, why I'd revealed everything in such a public way. I don't share all of this to humiliate anyone, I said, and my voice carried across the silent ballroom where 200 people stood frozen watching this drama unfold. I share it because I refuse to be diminished. I won't sign away my worth, whether that's literal or figurative. I won't accept being treated as less than by people who never took the time to know me or value me. And I looked around at the faces staring back at me, some sympathetic, some shocked, some calculating what this meant for their own social positions, and I continued. There were people here tonight who showed me genuine kindness over these past months, who saw me as a person regardless of what they thought about my bank account or my clothing, and I want to thank those few individuals for their decency and warmth. And I caught the eye of James's Aunt Margaret, who'd always been kind to me, and the club manager who'd treated me with respect, and I nodded to them specifically. And then I turned to Sarah and Marcus and Patricia and my legal team and said, "Thank you all for coming tonight and for your continued support. I know this wasn't the evening you expected." And Marcus smiled slightly and said, "We've got your back, Emma, always." And I felt a surge of gratitude for my real team, the people who'd stood beside me while I built something meaningful. I picked up my small clutch from the table where the prenuptial agreement still lay unsigned and now utterly irrelevant, and I walked toward the ballroom exit with my head high and my shoulders back. And I heard the whispers starting behind me, conversations erupting now that the main drama had concluded. And I was 3 steps from the door when I heard James call my name desperately. "Emma, wait, please wait." And I heard his footsteps hurrying after me, and I stopped and turned as he reached me, and his face was devastated, tears actually streaming down his cheeks now. And he grabbed my arm with both hands and said frantically, "Emma, please, I love you. I really do love you. I was so stupid and so weak, and I know I don't deserve another chance, but please, we can start over. I'll be different. I'll stand up to my family. I'll be the partner you need. Just please don't leave." And his words tumbled over each other in desperate succession, and I looked at him and felt a deep, aching sadness, because I could see he believed what he was saying in this moment. He genuinely thought love would be enough to overcome everything that had happened. I gently removed his hands from my arm, and I said quietly, so only he could hear, "James, you didn't love me. You loved the idea of someone who made you feel superior, someone who needed you instead of choosing you, someone who made you look generous and accomplished by comparison." And I watched him start to protest, and I held up my hand and continued, "I don't need a project, and I don't need someone to save me. I need a partner, an equal, someone who sees my strength and celebrates it instead of feeling threatened by it." And my voice was sad, but certain as I said, "You wanted someone grateful and easy and impressed by your family's money and status. And when you found someone you thought fit that description, you never looked deeper because you didn't want to see anything that would complicate the fantasy." I walked out of the country club into the cool evening air and felt like I was breathing properly for the first time in months. And I stood on the stone steps, looking up at the stars that were just becoming visible in the darkening sky. And I heard the door open behind me and Sarah's voice saying gently, "Emma, we're here." And I turned to see Sarah and Marcus and Patricia standing there with expressions of concern and support and something like pride. And I felt my composure crack slightly as Sarah pulled me into a hug and said, "You were magnificent in there, absolutely magnificent." And Marcus added, "I've seen you present to hostile investors and skeptical board members, but that was next level. Courage!" And I laughed a little shakily and said, "I don't feel courageous. I feel heartbroken and free at the same time, and I'm not sure how both things can be true simultaneously." And Sarah squeezed my hand and said, "Both things can absolutely be true. You loved him, or at least you loved who you hoped he could be, and now you're free from the reality of who he actually was. We stood there for a moment in the relative quiet away from the chaos inside, and I found myself thinking back to a moment 7 years earlier when I was 23 years old, sitting in my dorm room at MIT with my laptop and 3 energy drinks and a business plan that everyone told me was too ambitious. And I remembered my faculty advisor saying, "Emma, the enterprise software market is dominated by established players. A girl fresh out of college isn't going to disrupt that space." And I remembered the 17 venture capitalists who turned me down in those first 6 months, and I remembered one particularly dismissive partner who'd looked at my projections and said, "Sweetheart, come back when you have some real-world experience." And I'd wanted to throw my coffee in his face, but instead I'd smiled politely and walked out and worked twice as hard to prove him wrong. I remembered the first major client I'd landed through sheer persistence and innovation, the first time I made payroll for my tiny team of 4 people, the first time our revenue crossed $1 million, and then 5 million, and then 20 million. And I remembered every single person who'd dismissed me, or doubted me, or suggested I was too young, or too female, or too ambitious. And I'd built something extraordinary, not to spite them, but because I believed in the vision, and I believed in myself, even when almost nobody else did. "Emma," Marcus said gently, pulling me back to the present moment, and I realized I'd been standing there lost in memory, and I said, "I was just thinking about how hard I fought to build Technova, how many people told me I couldn't do it, how many obstacles I overcame, and I almost let James and his family make me feel like none of that mattered." And my voice was steady but sad as I continued. "I almost signed away my worth, literal and figurative, for a man who never even asked what my company did, or what problems we solved, or why the work mattered to me." The club door opened again, and I tensed, expecting James, but instead, Robert stepped out alone, and he walked toward us with his hands in his pockets, looking uncharacteristically uncertain, and he said, "Emma, may I have a moment?" And I nodded to Sarah and Marcus, who stepped a discreet distance away, but remained watchful. And Robert stood before me and said quietly, "I need to apologize. We were catastrophically wrong about you. I was catastrophically wrong. And I have no excuse except that we made assumptions based on appearances, and we never looked deeper." And I could see this was difficult for him, this man who was accustomed to being right and being deferred to, and he continued, "What you've built is genuinely impressive. The enterprise integration solutions alone are innovative, and your client retention rates are remarkable. I looked up your company's metrics while everyone was talking inside." And I almost smiled at how he defaulted to business analysis even in this moment, and he said carefully, "I know there's no salvaging what happened with James, but I wondered if you might consider potential business partnerships. My firm works with several companies that could benefit from your platform." And I looked at him for a long moment, and then I said gently but firmly, "Robert, I appreciate the apology, and I appreciate that you recognize what my company has accomplished, but some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt. You and your family spent months treating me as worthless, and I'm not interested in a business relationship built on the ashes of that disrespect." And I saw him absorb this and nod slowly and say, "I understand, that's fair, more than fair." And he turned to go back inside and then paused and said, "For what it's worth, my son is a fool and you deserve far better." And then he disappeared back into the club. 3 months passed like water flowing around stones in a river, and I watched my life transform in ways I'd always worked toward but had temporarily lost sight of during those months with James. And Technova's initial public offering happened on a Tuesday morning in September with me standing on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange surrounded by my team, and I rang the opening bell with Sarah on one side and Marcus on the other. And I watched our stock price climb throughout that first day of trading until the final valuation put my personal net worth at $240 million on paper. And Forbes ran a feature article calling me one of the most successful female tech entrepreneurs under 35. And I did 3 major conference keynotes about enterprise software solutions and women in technology. and my calendar filled with investor meetings and partnership discussions and media requests. And through all of it, I felt grounded in a way I hadn't felt during those months when I'd been playing a diminished version of myself. I attended a charity gala in late November, the same organization where I'd first met James nearly a year earlier, and I wore a stunning deep blue gown that had been custom made by a designer who specifically wanted to dress me after reading about the engagement party revelation. And I was standing near the silent auction tables examining the items when I sensed someone approaching and turned to find James standing there with Victoria beside him, and he looked different somehow. Smaller, maybe, or just less sure of himself. And Victoria looked elegant as always, but there was something tentative in her expression as they greeted me. And James said, "Emma, you look beautiful. Congratulations on everything, the IPO and all the success. I've been following the news." And I said, "Thank you, James. It's good to see you both." And I meant it in the distant, polite way you mean pleasantries with people who used to matter. And Victoria excused herself tactfully to get drinks, and James said quietly, "I owe you another apology, a better one than I gave you that night. I've been in therapy for the past 3 months working on understanding why I needed my family's approval so desperately that I couldn't stand up for someone I claimed to love." And I could see he meant it, could see there was genuine work happening behind his words. And I said, "I appreciate that, James. Truly, growth is hard work, and it matters that you're doing it." And he nodded and said, "I know there's no going back. I know I destroyed something that could have been extraordinary, and I'm not asking for another chance. I just wanted you to know that you were right about everything you said to me. And I'm sorry I couldn't be the partner you deserved." I looked at him standing there with such obvious regret written across his face, and I felt something shift inside me, not a rekindling of romantic feeling, but a final release of any remaining hurt or anger. And I said, "We both learned what we needed to learn. You're finding out who you are, separate from your family's expectations, and I learned to never make myself smaller for anyone." And he smiled sadly and said, "You were never small, Emma. I just couldn't see clearly from where I was standing." And the echo of my own thoughts from months ago surprised me, and Victoria returned with drinks and we talked for a few more minutes about neutral topics before they drifted away. And I watched them go and felt absolutely nothing except perhaps a distant hope that James would continue growing into someone better. I thought back to that first dinner at his family's estate, Charlotte's sneering comment about my cheap appearance, the way they'd all looked at me like I was something unfortunate James had tracked in on his shoe, and I remembered how small they'd tried to make me feel, how I'd sat at that table in my Target dress letting them believe I was worth nothing, and I understood now that the lesson had never really been about them at all. They'd believed the role I played because it confirmed their biases about worth and class and what made someone valuable. They'd looked at modest clothing and simple styling and assumed they were seeing someone's entire measure, and they'd been wrong not because I was secretly wealthy, but because no human being's worth is determined by their bank account, or their family name, or their designer labels. I'd played the role of someone diminished, and they'd believed it. And that said everything about their values and nothing about my actual worth. And the real lesson was about never making myself smaller again, never dimming my light or hiding my achievements or pretending to be less than I was just to make someone else comfortable. I drove back to Technova's headquarters after the gala and walked through the building that we'd moved into just 6 weeks earlier. 3 floors of open collaborative workspace and quiet offices, and a cafeteria that served actually good food, and a rooftop garden where employees could take breaks. And I found several of my team members still working, despite the late hour, because they loved what we were building. And Sarah looked up from her computer and said, "How was the gala?" And I said, "I ran into James. He's doing better, growing." And she studied my face and said, "And how are you?" And I smiled and said, "I'm free, Sarah. Completely free. I don't feel angry or hurt, or even particularly sad anymore. I just feel grateful that I learned what I needed to learn before I legally bound myself to someone who couldn't see me. I stood at the window of my office, looking out over the city lights stretching in every direction, and I thought about worth and value and recognition. And I understood finally that my worth had never been determined by whether James or his family recognized it. My worth existed independent of their acknowledgement, just as the sun exists, whether or not someone opens their eyes to see it. And the right people would always see me clearly from the start, because they'd be looking with open eyes and open hearts instead of prejudgment and bias. True worth isn't inherited from wealthy parents, or given by family connections, or determined by whether you can access old money social circles. True worth is created through work that matters and earned through persistence and struggle and recognized by people who value substance over surface. And I'd spent 7 years building something meaningful that solved real problems for real companies and employed talented people who believed in our mission. And that had worth, regardless of what anyone thought about my clothing or my background or my bank account. I was finally free from the need for external validation, free from making myself smaller to fit someone else's limited vision, free to be exactly who I was without apology or diminishment, and standing there in my office surrounded by evidence of everything I'd built, I felt grateful for every moment of that painful experience because it had taught me to value myself first and completely. And that was a lesson worth more than $240 million.